The Arctic was a graveyard of lost history. Beneath its endless sheets of ice, wreckage from forgotten wars, doomed expeditions, and vanished civilizations lay frozen, untouched by time. It was a place where the past never truly disappeared, only waited to be uncovered. And in 2018, something long buried finally resurfaced. At 2:46 a.m., a military surveillance satellite sweeping over the Arctic detected something unusual beneath the ice. The anomaly was metallic, roughly 80 meters in length, and perfectly intact. At first, analysts dismissed it as Cold War debris or a natural ice formation. But as they ran additional scans, the contours became unmistakable. It was a submarine, a WWII-era German U-boat lying beneath 60 meters of solid ice. The readings matched only one known vessel, U-977, a missing Nazi submarine last seen in 1943. No distress signals had ever been sent. No wreckage had ever been recovered. The submarine had simply vanished. And now, after 75 years, it had reappeared. But something was wrong. While reviewing the satellite data, Dr. William Carter, one of the world's leading marine archaeologists, noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Surrounding the wreck were tracks in the snow. At first, he assumed they were cracks in the ice. But as he zoomed in, the pattern became clear. Footprints. They weren't random. They looped around the wreck in a precise, deliberate path. It wasn't just one set of tracks. There were dozens, maybe hundreds, all following the same circular motion, as if something had been patrolling the submarine. Carter received the official request within 24 hours. The U.S. government had approved an expedition to excavate the wreck, with Carter leading a small research team. His mission: confirm the submarine's identity, recover historical artifacts and crew remains, determine why it had been lost. But no one could explain the tracks. Wildlife? Unlikely. No Arctic wolves had been recorded this far north in over a century. Military activity? Impossible. The area had been untouched for decades. And then came the most disturbing fact. The tracks were fresh. Something, or someone, had been moving near the submarine just days before the satellite passed overhead. But the ice had been unbroken for 75 years. So who, or what, had been walking there? By early March 2018, Carter arrived at an isolated Arctic research station, the last outpost before their expedition into the ice fields. His team was small but highly specialized. Dr. Helena Brooks, biologist, expert in Arctic wildlife. Lieutenant James Reynolds, military specialist overseeing security. Dr. Amir Patel, glaciologist, studying ice formations. Dr. Lisa Trent, military historian, researching U-977's classified records. They had 4 days of travel ahead of them, crossing the frozen wasteland by heavy-duty snow vehicles, braving temperatures that dropped to -50 degrees Celsius, to reach the wreck. But the Arctic was not a forgiving place. And they were not alone. The first 48 hours of travel were uneventful. The Arctic stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast, silent desert of white. But on the third night, something changed. Carter lay awake in his tent, listening to the wind howling across the frozen plains. But then, he heard something else. A low, resonant howl echoed across the ice. It wasn't the sharp yelp of an Arctic fox. It wasn't the distant moan of shifting glaciers. It was deeper, louder, almost human. Carter sat up, listening. Then, Helena unzipped the tent, her face pale. Her breath formed frantic clouds in the cold air. "Carter," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. Her voice was trembling. "We're not alone out here." Carter grabbed his flashlight, stepping outside. The cold bit through his clothes like knives, but he barely noticed. Helena pointed toward the horizon. Carter followed her gaze, and his stomach twisted into ice. Just beyond their outermost perimeter, something stood on the ridgeline, barely visible in the dark. It was large, larger than any wolf Carter had ever seen. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Then, another shape appeared, then another, and another. 4, 5, 6 of them, unmoving, silent, waiting. Carter whispered, "Wolves?" Helena swallowed. "Bigger than wolves." Then, without a sound, the figures turned and vanished into the darkness. The next morning, the team pressed forward toward the wreck site. No one spoke about what they had seen. But the wolves never left. They kept their distance, always watching. Never attacking, like they were waiting for something. By midday, they reached their destination. Carter climbed onto the ridge, his breath forming mist in the air as he looked down. There, half buried in the frozen abyss, was the U-977, a submarine that should not exist. But something else caught his eye. Near the wreck, perfectly preserved in the ice, were fresh paw prints, the exact same pattern from the satellite images. Helena knelt beside one, pressing her gloved hand against the print for scale. She whispered, "Carter, these tracks." He turned to her. "What?" She swallowed hard. "These wolves. They've been walking this same path for decades." Carter felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. Because that could only mean one thing. The wolves weren't just wandering, they were guarding something. And now, for the first time in 75 years, someone had come to disturb it. The Arctic stretched infinitely around them, silent and merciless. For 3 days, Carter's team had battled the frozen wasteland to reach the site. The U-977 lay half-buried in the ice, a relic of war untouched for 75 years. But the wreck was not what disturbed them most. The tracks surrounding it, the same looping footprints circling the wreck in perfect calculated patterns, had been preserved in the ice for generations. And the wolves, the giant unnatural wolves, watched from a distance, unmoving, waiting, as if they knew something the team did not. "Let's get started," Carter said, forcing his voice to remain steady. The excavation began immediately. Heavy-duty thermal drills melted through the layers of ancient ice. Engineers carefully positioned stabilization equipment, ensuring the wreck wouldn't collapse once it was fully uncovered. The process took 3 days. During that time, the wolves never left. They did not approach the team, nor did they show aggression. They simply watched. It was unnerving, but Carter had no time to dwell on it. By the morning of the 4th day, the submarine's hull was exposed, glistening in the dim Arctic light. It was in pristine condition. There were no torpedo holes, no signs of battle damage, no distress signals ever recorded. And yet, the entire crew had vanished without a trace. Carter exhaled, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "We open it today." The main entry hatch of U-977 was sealed shut, encased in layers of frost and corrosion. Lieutenant James Reynolds and his military team secured hydraulic presses against the metal, preparing to pry it open. Carter stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the wolves. They had stopped pacing. Now they sat in perfect silence, staring at the submarine, as if they knew what was about to happen. Reynolds signaled to his men, "All right, let's break this thing open." The press engaged, groaning as it forced the rusted metal to move. Then, a sharp metallic snap, the hatch popped open. A low hiss of freezing air escaped from within. The stench that followed made Carter's stomach tighten. It wasn't the smell of rot, it was too ancient for that. It was stale, metallic, wrong, like something had been waiting inside. Carter lifted his flashlight, the beam cutting through the pitch-black corridor of the submarine's interior. The first thing he saw were boots, then bodies. The entire crew of U-977 was still inside, frozen in time. Helena Brooks let out a sharp breath behind him. Oh my God. There were no signs of struggle, no gunshot wounds, no panic. Most of them were still seated at their stations, their faces blank as if they had fallen asleep and never woken up. Reynolds knelt beside one of the bodies, his gloved hand hovering over its uniformed chest. "They didn't die from starvation," he murmured. Carter agreed. "Something killed them." But what? Helena moved cautiously toward the command room. Pinned to the navigation table, encased in a thin layer of frost, was a journal. Carter recognized it instantly. It was the logbook of Captain Heinrich Kaufmann, the final record of U-977's voyage. Helena carefully brushed away the frost. The ink was faded but still readable. Carter's heart pounded as he read the last recorded entry. November 2nd, 1943. The wolves have come. They do not attack. They circle. They wait. It is as if they do not want us to leave, or perhaps they know it is too late. We sealed the hatch. The air is running out. But I hear them now, not the wolves. The others. We should not have come here. They are coming. A cold dread settled in Carter's chest. Helena's hands trembled as she turned the page. The final words of the logbook were scrawled in uneven, desperate handwriting. They are already here. The entire submarine felt wrong. The bodies, the lack of damage, the way the crew had simply stopped. But the worst part was yet to come. Helena moved toward the lower deck, her flashlight cutting through the icy darkness. Then, she stopped. She wasn't alone. Something stood at the end of the corridor. At first, she thought it was another frozen body, but then, it moved. A low creaking noise echoed through the sub. Helena's breath hitched. Then, the lights flickered, and the thing in the darkness took a step forward. Helena Brooks froze. At the end of the narrow corridor, deep inside U-977's lower deck, something stood in the darkness. At first, she thought it was another frozen corpse, one of the many crewmen still trapped inside this metal tomb. But then, it moved. A slow, deliberate step forward. The floor creaked beneath its weight. The air felt heavier. Helena's heart pounded against her ribs. Her flashlight flickered. Then, the thing turned its head toward her. Helena's entire body went cold. The figure looked like a man. It wore a uniform. Its skin was pale, too pale, stretched tightly over unnaturally sharp features. But it was the eyes that made her breath catch in her throat. They weren't human. They were black, completely black, as if something else was staring out from inside the body. The creature tilted its head. It opened its mouth, but no breath came out. Helena's instincts screamed at her to run. She took a shaky step backward, and then the lights went out. The entire submarine shuddered. Somewhere deep inside the wreck, a low groaning sound echoed through the steel walls, like something had awakened. Helena's breath came in sharp gasps. She couldn't see. She couldn't move. Then, footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps, moving toward her. Something brushed past her shoulder. Helena choked back a scream, spun around blindly, and ran. She crashed into a wall, stumbled, her arms flailing in the pitch-black corridor. Then a hand grabbed her wrist. Helena shrieked. But then, Helena, it's me. A flashlight flared to life, nearly blinding her. Dr. William Carter's face appeared in the glow. She had never been so relieved in her life. Carter tightened his grip on her arm. Come on, he hissed, pulling her toward the main deck. Behind them, the groaning metal grew louder. A deep, unnatural sound, like the submarine was breathing. Helena's pulse thundered in her ears. I saw something, she gasped, stumbling up the ladder behind Carter. He didn't stop. You're not the only one. Helena's stomach tightened. What do you mean? Carter didn't answer. Instead, he pulled her onto the upper deck, where Lieutenant James Reynolds and the others were already waiting. Their faces were pale. Their weapons were raised. Something's down here with us, Reynolds said grimly. His rifle was trained on the corridor. The shadows at the end of the hall twisted. And then, the whispering started. The sound didn't come from one direction. It came from everywhere. Soft, indecipherable voices, echoing through the steel corridors of the dead submarine. Helena clamped a hand over her mouth. The voices were wrong. Too many of them. Too distorted. As if something old was trying to speak, but couldn't. Reynolds tightened his grip on his weapon. Jesus Christ, he whispered. Then, the hatch behind them slammed shut. The entire submarine shook violently. The whispering grew louder. And then, the bodies began to move. The dead crew of U-977 had been untouched for 75 years, their faces frozen in eerie silence. Their bodies perfectly preserved in the Arctic ice. But now, they were breathing. The chest of the nearest corpse rose and fell, a slow, unnatural movement. Helena's stomach lurched. That's not possible. Then, one of them turned its head. Carter grabbed her arm. Move, now! The team bolted for the exit. Behind them, the whispers grew frantic. The air inside the submarine shifted. Thick, suffocating, wrong. Something ancient stirred in the darkness, and it wasn't letting them leave. The moment they emerged from the hatch, the cold air hit them like a shock. But Carter didn't care. They had made it out. He turned, breathless, heart-pounding, and nearly stumbled. The wolves were still there, but they had moved closer. They no longer circled the submarine. Now they stood between the team and their vehicles, blocking the way. Their yellow eyes locked onto the researchers. Carter swallowed, his throat dry. "They're not stopping us from getting in," he murmured. Helena's breath hitched. "They're stopping us from leaving." The realization hit like a hammer. The wolves weren't keeping people away from the wreck. They were keeping something inside. And now, Carter had a horrifying suspicion. It had just followed them out. The wolves stood perfectly still. Their yellow eyes reflected the dim Arctic light, unblinking. Carter's breath came in shallow gasps. Something wasn't right. The team had barely escaped the submarine, the whispers, the breathing corpses, the thing that had watched Helena in the dark. But now, the wolves were blocking their way, keeping them trapped. And Carter realized the horrifying truth. The wolves weren't stopping them from getting in. They were stopping them from letting something out. Reynolds was the first to break the silence. "Move," he barked, gripping his rifle. The team rushed toward the snow vehicles, but the wolves didn't budge. Helena grabbed Carter's arm. "They're not attacking," she whispered. Carter's mind raced. They had seen wolves hunt before. They moved in calculated patterns, circling their prey, testing for weakness. But this was different. The wolves weren't hunting. They were guarding. And then, something moved behind them. A sound echoed across the ice. Not the wind, not the groan of shifting glaciers. Something else. A low, guttural sound like a breath drawn too deep, like something learning how to inhale for the first time in centuries. Helena turned, her stomach tightening. And then she saw it. A dark figure stepping out from the hatch of U-977. It walked like a man. It wore the uniform of the dead crew, but it wasn't human. Its movements were wrong, too fluid, too unnatural, as if it had forgotten how to use its own limbs. And its eyes, black. Completely black. As if the thing inside it was only wearing the body like a disguise. Reynolds raised his rifle, his hands steady, his jaw clenched. "Drop it," he shouted. The thing in the uniform tilted its head, as if it didn't understand the words. Then it smiled, a slow, unnatural grin that stretched too wide across its face, and then it moved. Too fast. Too impossibly fast. Reynolds fired first. Boom. The shot echoed across the Arctic wasteland. A bullet hit its chest, and it didn't stop. The thing didn't even flinch. It just kept coming. And then, the wolves moved, as one. The pack lunged, racing across the snow in a blur of motion, fangs bared, claws tearing through the ice. A wall of fur and muscle crashed into the thing, sending it sprawling into the snow. But it didn't go down easily. It snarled, a sound that wasn't human, wasn't animal, wasn't anything natural. A deafening, otherworldly howl that sent ice splintering beneath their feet. The wolves tore into it. But the thing did not bleed. Instead, its form twisted, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. Carter's stomach turned. The thing wasn't a man. It wasn't even a body anymore. It was something trying to hold a shape, and it was failing. Carter grabbed Helena and bolted for the vehicles. Reynolds and the rest of the team weren't far behind. The wolves were still fighting, a blur of fur and fangs keeping the thing from following. But Carter knew. They wouldn't hold it forever. They reached the snow vehicles. Helena jumped into the driver's seat of the first one, Carter beside her. Reynolds and the others piled into the second. "Go, go!" The engines roared to life. The vehicles lurched forward, tearing across the Arctic ice. Behind them, the wolves howled. And then, the thing screamed. It wasn't a normal scream. It wasn't human. It was something older. Something that hadn't seen the surface of this world in a long, long time. Helena's knuckles went white on the wheel. What the hell was that? Carter couldn't answer, because he wasn't sure he wanted to know. But as the wreck of U-9977 faded behind them, one thing was clear. They had never been alone out there. And now, something was awake. The vehicles tore across the ice, engines roaring against the howling Arctic wind. Carter didn't look back. He didn't have to. The wolves were still howling, their cries echoing across the frozen wasteland. And beneath those howls, the thing screamed again. Helena's voice shook as she gripped the wheel, her eyes locked on the endless expanse of ice ahead. Carter didn't answer. He couldn't, because he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Reynolds' voice crackled through the radio. Did you see that thing? Carter grabbed the radio, his breath coming in short gasps. It wasn't human. A pause. Reynolds' voice came back, lower now. No, it wasn't. And then, the ground shook. Helena slammed the brakes, the vehicle skidding across the snow. Carter's stomach lurched as a deep rumbling vibrated through the ice. Reynolds' vehicle stopped beside them, its headlights cutting through the swirling snow. The earth trembled again, a sound like thunder, but deeper, older. Carter jumped out, his boots crunching against the frozen ground, and then the ice cracked. A massive fissure split the tundra, stretching back toward U-97. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, something moved beneath the ice, a dark shape, writhing just below the surface. Reynolds shouted, but Carter couldn't move. His mind reeled. The submarine's crew hadn't just died, they had been consumed. And now, the thing that took them was waking up. The ice shattered. A black, shapeless mass erupted from the fissure, unfolding like liquid shadow. Carter stumbled back, his breath freezing in his lungs. It was massive, twisting, shifting, trying to take shape but failing. It wasn't a creature. It was an absence of form, like something not meant to exist in this world. Something that had been buried for a reason. A flash of movement. The wolves attacked again. They launched themselves at the thing, their teeth tearing into the shifting blackness. But there was nothing to tear. The thing didn't have flesh. It absorbed the wolves like ink spilling into water, their howls cut off mid-scream. Helena clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. They're sacrificing themselves. Carter's chest tightened. The wolves had been here for generations, standing guard, keeping this thing trapped. And now, they were buying them time. Go, Carter shouted. Helena slammed the gas. The vehicle lurched forward, tires skidding on the ice. Reynolds' truck followed, the headlights bouncing wildly as they raced away. The wolves fought. But Carter knew the truth. They couldn't win, not against this. And as the thing rose higher, spilling across the ice like a living shadow, Carter realized they had made a mistake. They never should have opened that crate. The snowstorm raged around them, but Carter couldn't hear it anymore. All he could hear was the thing screaming. It wasn't a sound meant for human ears. It was wrong. A sound that dug into his skull, twisting like a knife. Helena was shaking at the wheel, her hands clenched so tightly around it that her knuckles had turned white. Behind them, the wolves were still fighting, but they were losing. Helena's voice cracked with desperation. They're dying. Carter clenched his jaw. They knew the risk. Helena whipped her head toward him, her face full of rage. That's not an answer. And then, the ground shook again. Reynolds' Hap truck swerved violently, nearly tipping over. What the hell is that thing? He shouted over the radio. Carter didn't know, but he knew one thing. It wasn't from this world. Carter grabbed the radio, his breath coming fast and sharp. We need to make it back to base. If we stay out here, we're dead. Reynolds hesitated. And then, a sickening wet sound came through the speakers. A guttural clicking, something inhuman. Reynolds froze. Did you hear that? The radio hissed, and then, a voice. Not static, not interference. A voice that did not belong to anything human. It whispered, low and broken. A language no one should know. A language that had no name. Carter's blood ran cold, because whatever it was speaking back. Reynolds' voice was flat. Dead. Carter turned. Reynolds' vehicle had come to a full stop. The headlights shone into the snowstorm, illuminating a figure standing in the road. At first, Carter thought it was a man, but then it moved wrong. Its limbs bent in ways that no human should move. Its face was blurred, shifting, like it wasn't fully real. And its eyes, they were the same yellow as the wolves. Carter's voice was barely a whisper. Reynolds didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the thing. His hand reached for the door handle. James. The thing twitched. And then, it was inside the truck. Reynolds screamed. Helena didn't hesitate. She slammed the gas, the vehicle roaring forward. Carter whipped around just in time to see the truck folded in on itself. Not crushed, not torn apart, it collapsed like paper. And then, the thing that had been Reynolds stood back up. Its head snapped toward them, its eyes burned through the snow, and then it started running. The wolves were already moving. They rushed past Carter's truck, their bodies blurring against the snow. And then, they hit it all at once. Teeth, claws, snarls. They tore into the thing, dragging it down. The thing screamed, and then vanished into the ice. Carter couldn't breathe. Helena was sobbing, gripping the wheel so hard her fingers bled. Reynolds was gone. The wolves were still standing. And Carter finally understood. They weren't just guarding the wreck. They were holding something in. Carter grabbed the radio. We're sealing it. Helena's breath hitched, but Carter's hands shook. We never should have opened that crate. Outside, the wolves lifted their heads one last time and howled. The storm had passed, but the Arctic had never felt colder. Carter stood at the edge of the excavation site, staring at the frozen tomb below him. The submarine, the artifact, the thing that had taken Reynolds. It all had to go back under the ice. Helena stood beside him, bruised, shaking, but alive. We can't just leave him, she whispered. Carter closed his eyes. James is gone. Helena clenched her fists. You don't know that. Carter turned to her, his face pale, hollowed out. I know that what was in that truck, he swallowed hard, wasn't him anymore. The wind howled. The wolves stood at a distance, their yellow eyes still fixed on the wreckage, waiting, watching. They knew what had to be done. Carter lifted the radio. Blow it. A long silence. Then, a single response. Roger that. A low rumble began beneath their feet. Explosives planted around the site detonated. The ice shattered, and the Arctic swallowed U-977 whole. The dust settled. The wreck was gone. The entrance to the abyss sealed forever beneath meters of reinforced ice. Carter and Helena stood in silence, their breath visible in the frigid air. The wolves turned one last time. Then, without a sound, they began to disappear into the snow. Back into the emptiness. Back into the legend. Days later, Carter sat in a military debriefing room, his fingers wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. A man in a dark suit sat across from him. You found something, the man said. Carter didn't respond. The man leaned forward. What was inside that submarine, Dr. Carter? Carter met his eyes. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, nothing worth finding. The man stared at him. Then he nodded. And just like that, the entire mission was erased. The military sealed the records. The wreckage of U-977 was officially never found, and Carter never spoke of it again. 1 year later, a lone Arctic researcher was flying a survey drone over the region where U-977 had been sealed. A routine check. Everything was normal. The ice remained untouched. Then the drone's camera glitched, just for a second, and in that second, it captured something moving beneath the ice. A shape. Not human, not wolf. Something else. The screen flickered. And then, the feed cut to static.